Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Desrosiers, and I am the president and CEO of 100 Miles. We are a coastal conservation organization operating here on the Georgia coast with the mission of preserving and protecting Georgia's 100-mile coast through advocacy, education, and civic engagement. I'm here with my colleague, Jazz Watts. We're sharing a computer today, and we are going to be your moderators. I wanted to just start off by welcoming you, welcome, and to tell you just a little bit about Drawdown Georgia and what our goal is here today. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Drawdown Georgia is a statewide research-based initiative with a vision of scaling Georgia-specific climate solutions in ways that prioritize equity and public health, create jobs, and nurture the natural environment. The goal is to build a diverse and inclusive movement to lift up and celebrate our state's progress on 5 fronts. They are transportation, building and materials, food and agriculture, electricity, and land sinks. I was looking at the Drawdown Georgia website today as I was thinking about how to introduce this panel. And their website says that they bring together researchers from across the state to localize work, highlight climate solutions that make the most sense for Georgia, those with a strong track record that are cost competitive and market ready. Drawdown Georgia has grown into a leaderful movement, including many partners and funders working to advance climate solutions in Georgia. The goal of our session today is to highlight some of the good people and organizations working to improve community resilience across our coast. At 100 Miles, we think about resilience as humans, communities, populations, as their ability to overcome adversity to threats. And so from our perspective here, the panelists and Jazz and I, we don't think you can think about resilience without first thinking about the threats that our communities, populations, and people have to overcome. And some of those include, and two of the threats that we think about a lot at 100 Miles that I'm going to talk to you about are, you can see it every day, development. Here on the coast, we are dealing with development that is where we're thinking about land consumption outpacing the rate of our population growth by 7 times. So in other words, we're sprawling. We're building in inefficient patterns and in inappropriate places. The second threat that we think about is sea level rise. And if you look at the data from the last 80 years, it is evident that our sea levels on the Georgia coast have risen between 8 and 10 inches, depending on where you are. And so when you combine the inappropriate places where we're growing in the inappropriate patterns with the rate of sea level rise, what we come to is we're putting people in harm's way. And some of the conditions that people live in and their quality of life here on the coast even further exacerbate those threats. And Jazz is going to talk to you about those.
Yeah, so I think our conversation today, when we're talking about all of these issues, is how do we connect them? You know, how do we connect the dots? To a certain sense, whether we're talking about tidal wetlands, um, uh, 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 freshwater, or coastal resilience issues, to the communities that are in these spaces. I think when I think of these issues, I think of them, from a community standpoint in a certain sense. When we look at the fact that, most of these frontline communities that are, directly impacted by climate change and sea level rise are also dealing with systemic inequities in racism and poverty, lack of access to resources. So all of these things. So what the threats that they deal with are exacerbated. So all of us are facing these challenges, but some of us are disproportionately even more impacted. So I think that as we talk today, we want you all to think about the work that you're doing in the spaces that you're in. And if you think you're doing enough, maybe think about the things that you haven't done, the relationships that you don't have, the spaces and the people that you don't know in organizations that are grassroots or neighborhoods or community, organizations or planning assemblies and things of that nature that you're not connected to that are right there on the front line. And so I think that we're going to go ahead and get started, but I would just say as we're having this conversation, just really take the time to think about all of that, and most of all, to think about how it all connects one to the other as we're having the discussion. So.
So our three panelists are going to start off by introducing themselves and the work that they're doing. And we have asked them, can you read the three questions that we asked them to answer whenever they prepared their?
Yeah, so there are three questions that we kind of said that in this conversation and discussion that we're having that we hope that we'll be able to answer for you and even more. How do you define resilience? What are some of the challenges for these solutions to be successful? And we're talking about past, present, and future. And how did the uniqueness of your situation and your work lead to that success, or even lead to the ongoing challenges that you're facing today?
Yeah, so we're going to kick it off with Christy Lambert from the Nature Conservancy. This is a moderated discussion, so the three panelists are going to go with their presentations. They'll be about 10 minutes each. And then Jazz and I have some questions for them, but we would like to encourage you to submit your questions in the chat as well.
Thank you, Megan. Really excited and honored to be here this afternoon with you all to have this conversation. And I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm based out of our office on the coast. And I have the great opportunity to work throughout our coastal area. And today I want to zoom in and to talk about conservation, some of the ways from a conservation standpoint, some of the ways that we work in partnership with many and work towards resiliency. And some of the things that I'll touch on along the way include examples from rivers to reefs, and talking about connections and different importance from the significance from the global and the national and local levels, and also of how on the Georgia coast, how our work goes from different scales and from different geographies and different land and water types, and how one of the things that we have that I feel is so unique is this real mosaic, this mosaic of habitats and mosaic of people, and how by working together that we can strive and reach for and get closer towards having a resilient Georgia coast. Next. All along the Georgia coast, from South Carolina to Florida, 100 miles of Georgia coast with multiple habitat types and our 14 barrier island complexes. And I just love the image on the right, a color infrared, that really lets us see, thinking about the red that's reflecting evergreen. So those evergreen habitat types from the live oaks on the coast all the way to the pines up beyond the Okefenokee on the west and up that middle Altamaha River. So just to take that, to think about it from that perspective, that aerial, that large landscape and seascape perspective. Next. And also, we have to look in and up the state, into the state, in order to protect our coastal areas. So considering those watersheds, the watersheds that, the activities, the land and water practices that come down through those watersheds do have an impact on our coastal areas. And that gray area, if you go out all the way towards the coast and the mouth of those rivers, the gray area, those are the watersheds for our tidal creeks. So those are within the tidal areas of extents, and those areas are very important too for the health of our coastal waters, our health of our salt marshes and our oysters. So taking that perspective and thinking about breaking it down, and that's one of the things that I feel like over the years with the Nature Conservancy and my work that I've really come to appreciate even more is this changing scales and perspectives throughout. So looking at it from a large landscape and seascapes perspective, and then going down and zooming in and learning about it and communicating and planning at even an intermediate scale, and then at that very local scale. And I just think by working at those multiple scales and sharing, and also working with people throughout that we could come up with some of the wisest and best solutions for our situations. Next. And this is not going to go through all this, but I'm sharing with you some of the things. This is from our Nature Conservancy, from part of our strategic plan. And so I just wanted to point out that this has been informed. We've worked over the years with multiple stakeholders and groups throughout the coastal and up in the watersheds to look at and develop these long-term visions and thinking about a resilient network of coastal and marine ecosystems, of how we can sustain it, and how that network can support those species and habitats, oyster reefs, salt marshes, sounds and estuaries, and many more different examples that are called out here. And all of this in the face of climate and population changes, and how these habitats, we want to take care of them so that they'll continue to provide these ecosystem services that are essential for both nature and for people. And thinking about, we have the opportunity, and we think about all the experts in our coastal area and all the experiences and the partnerships for us to be able to work to protect this rich diversity and health, thinking of functions and connectivity, so that we can learn these lessons, transfer those practices, and cultivate stewards that we can then work together to safeguard our coastal area and the associated habitats and the people. Okay, next. Salt marsh, Georgia, critical for our important salt marsh, and there are initiatives going on right now that many people are engaged in working together and developing a South Atlantic salt marsh an action plan, initiative and action plan. And so each of these, we can look through the lenses, as I said, getting really small and detailed, and come up with plans and think about how those areas connect with other areas. And the salt marsh, very critical. Georgia has over a quarter of the Atlantic salt marsh habitat. And then these salt marshes, that extension west, looking at those areas of where our marshes extend. Next. And when we think about protecting salt marshes, which is on the left, an example of that on the left, we have to think about the future and with the changes that are projected of how we need to protect those corridors and those tidal areas, both saltwater tidal, freshwater tidal, and even the freshwater forest, which is on the right. That's an example in the Altamaha River of a fantastic example of a freshwater tidal bald cypress tupelo forest that is globally important. It seems common to us maybe on the coast because we do have some good examples of it, but it is a unique habitat type. And it's important for what it does right now from a filtering and protecting and helping with our water quality and our water quantity, and also in the future of what it will provide habitat for and space for. Next. Just briefly on this, I want to zoom into the oyster part of our coast and working to, and thinking of a vision for this, working toward the resilient network of healthy oyster reefs and these adjacent salt marshes and shorelines and estuaries with high productivity and species diversity. And how will we do that? This is something that we're really approaching from an integrated way. So not looking at it just as oysters for habitat or oysters for harvest for commercial fishers, but looking at the whole integrated big picture and working together in partnership to really have this inclusive and diverse stakeholder participation, and to have a process with a very equitable participation as people, as leaders throughout, and really from the planning all the way out through the communications, and to really strive for community-led and leadership throughout this, and bringing together living shorelines, oysters for harvest, oyster aquaculture, oysters for community, and oysters for our traditions, our overall heritage, and thinking of what we can do to really take care of oysters in this integrated approach. And so you see some photos there on it, just thinking about the top photo, thinking about that larger area of oysters. We really have to think about it at a landscape scale And photo there of working, folks from working Sapelo Island, organization Shelter Shore and solo organization there working. And then the next photo is that's for the recycling oyster shell project. The next photo is oyster restoration, and then an example of a living shoreline on Little Cumberland Island. Next. This is 1800s, late 1800s along the Georgia coast. Next. Today, we have more of a veneer of oysters. So we've harvested oysters and we haven't returned shells to provide that substrate. And so our practice is now to try to help to restore these oysters. Next. And thinking about those ecosystem services that oysters do provide, everything from habitat to oyster fisheries and shoreline protection. Next. And so working together through integrated oyster management to achieve that and to come up with a common vision. Next. This Ernest McIntosh, Mr. McIntosh and his family work on are fishers based out of McIntosh County. And they are some of the first fishers towards oyster aquaculture on the Georgia coast, which is relatively new an innovative practice in Georgia. Georgia is different from a shoreline with high energy areas. And so a lot of it really provides, there's a great need to develop and test methods. So we're often the testing ground and we start with these pilot projects. And Mr. McIntosh, the Nature Conservancy has a program called Supporting Oyster Aquaculture and Restoration, and working with a small grants program. And when Mr. McIntosh secured a grant through this, he wanted to use that to engage the youth, because he said people don't really know about oysters now. They don't know that that's even an option. And so he's working with students to be able to develop a work-study program through McIntosh Academy to help train people in the field of aquaculture. And not just aquaculture, that they want the ecology and oyster restoration and oyster recycling and all these elements to be a part of that program. Next. Benefits of living shorelines. And living shorelines are projects to use the alternatives as an alternative to bulkheads. Next. This is one of the priority living shorelines right now on the Georgia coast is at Harris Neck, the Harris Neck community. Rather than having a bulkhead there, working in partnership with many, working with the local community there in McIntosh, Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Natural Resources, the Harris Neck community there, Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Community, to be a part of this project and to come up with a plan for this living shoreline and also connecting it to Sapelo Island and other places. Next. And to bring in people as leaders. So this is just when you step back and think, why oysters? And think about all those connections across oysters and how it's something we can come together around to create these visions and shared visions and work plans. Next. Now just to zoom in and quickly look up from a watershed, looking at the watersheds along the coast. Next. And all the way out and recognizing Gray's Reef National Marine Sanctuary off the Georgia coast and how that is connected. As Jazz said, let's think about connections today. So thinking about the connections there. Next. Next, these are some examples. Just give some visuals of looking upstream at different habitat types. Next. And how this next. Now I'm zooming in on a big collaborative project next of the Altamaha River, of how working with a shared vision and plan, how we can protect the Altamaha River. Next. Working together with this patchwork and this mosaic of conservation lands. And today we have a group of us working in partnership with 100 Miles, Department of Natural Resources, Little St. Simons Island, and others to think about how we can fill gaps looking at smaller areas and for multiple purposes for a land protection. So looking at developing a land protection options for smaller areas. Next. And basing this on science, a strong foundation of science, and bringing people together around opportunities. And this is showing some of the important statewide action plan project areas from the Department of Natural Resources, with lots of collaboration to develop this plan, and it's in the process of being updated. So it's another example of working together towards this. Next. And I want to mention another scale, looking at zooming in now at a county scale, this level of work. Working with counties on a Camden County Resilience Implementation Work Plan with multiple partners there that you see. And my colleague Ashby Worley-Nix heads up this effort. And also I want to call out another different scale of project is working towards siting. As Megan pointed out, we have some of the siting issues that we have. So thinking of siting and how programs like this and solar siting tools, which we have, there'll be some links attached to this. Next. And to be able to have tools, next, to pull into this overall types of planning, working together. And I just want to close with this example. So this is, thinking about coastal resiliency for nature and people, and thinking through those different lenses, for the healthy oceans, and how I really think that by kind of going back and forth, zooming in on what your priority is, and then connecting it with all of these other maybe different priorities, and finding those overlaps and those opportunities for common and shared visions. I'll stop with that and look forward to more conversations about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy. It's time to move on to Jill.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and I see so many familiar names in the participant list, so it's good to connect with you all again. My name is Jill Gamble. I'm the Executive Director and Senior Research Associate at Georgia Tech. I lead the Coastal Equity and Resilience Hub, or the SEER Hub. Before this, I was at UGA for 13 years with UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. And so hopefully we had a chance to collaborate there. And if not, look forward to connecting with you if you're interested in anything I'm going to be talking about. You can go on to the next slide. So the Coastal Equity and Resilience Hub is a network or initiative where we're bringing together nonprofit organizations, environmental justice organizations, local governments, and academic institutions. And we're working to co-develop knowledge, tools, approaches to building community resilience. This includes JAS as part of the coalition. Dawood is also, who will be speaking next, part of the team. And we try to work hand in hand with communities to create fair and just solutions. So really thinking through some of the things that Jazz was talking about before, as far as, disproportionate impacts, and following communities in where they're leading, where we're kind of providing support to the communities, helping them access data, helping them, research different issues, but they're really leading the projects. You can see these are some of the founding partners of the SEER Hub. You can go on to the next one. And so Megan and Jazz asked for a definition of resilience. This is the definition that I personally use. It's the ability of a community to equitably prevent, withstand, respond to, and recover from a shock or stressor. Equitably is a really important aspect of that often gets overlooked in resilience work. Shock and stressor. So shock, I think of that as, these one-time kind of big events like a hurricane. Stressors are the longer term underlying pressures on a community, like climate change, or systemic inequity or racism, having equitable access to resources, population growth, like Megan said, coastal development. And so there's interaction between those two. And if we're just thinking about the big events and we're ignoring some of those, longer term, like simmering pressures, this stands that we may not actually be building the resilience of the community. And then we focus on both reducing a community's risk through trying to be as holistic as possible in our approaches and finding co-benefits, while also increasing adaptive capacity. And so that's required us to have a really hard look in thinking about building capacity at some of the extractive processes and practices that exist that have led to existing conditions, including within our own institutions, and trying to kind of rethink the partnerships that we're forming. You can go ahead to the next one. So these are some of the core values that underline our work. We're focusing mostly on disadvantaged communities that are experiencing the disproportionate impacts of climate change and environmental injustices. We also believe that the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, that a researcher that is not from that community, while we have very valuable information and knowledge to share, it really is that local knowledge and in some cases the traditional knowledge that are the most critical in helping to come up with solutions. We also partner with communities really focused on strengths rather than starting from kind of a needs-based approach. This has been developed by Jenny Hirsch at Georgia Tech. An asset-based approach where we look at all the assets and the strengths within the communities, the relationships, and try to build upon that rather than seeing it as a deficit. We also strive to build trust and be accountable and transparent with the communities. And then the next piece is really critical. We try to equitably share power and distribute resources. This means that sometimes the funding is, we're just passing it along as much as we can to our partners. We negotiate lower indirect rates. For those of you that are within universities, you'll know what I mean by that. And we try to share power so that it doesn't have to be myself leading a project. We actually would prefer that it's the local community that's leading, and we can provide support in the background. And then we believe that, collaborating is better than if we're working in our own silos. Go to the next one. So this work began about 6 years ago through Georgia Tech's Smart Sea Level Sensor project. You guys may remember back in 2016, 2017, Georgia coast experienced a Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Irma. We had a lot of flooding issues. We have one long-term tide gauge along the Georgia coast, and we were seeing really different impacts in communities, but we didn't have a great way of capturing that. And so Georgia Tech developed these low-cost, inexpensive sensors that could monitor water levels in real time. And they've been deploying them throughout Chatham County. There's 64 installed right now. And they're being used for emergency management purposes. They've also developed a dashboard for viewing knowing which neighborhoods need to be responded to first, and which bridges and roads are being impacted. And then there's a lot of modeling that's going into that as well. You can go on to the next one. And so we initially began with this framework really focused on flooding. And we had, our modeling, our sensors planning, education, workforce development. If you go on to the next one. But as we began to work with communities, we heard a lot of other concerns. In Brunswick, they're very concerned about contamination from the 4 Superfund sites that they have. We're hearing about food security issues and, concerns with heirs property and land retention, air quality issues from the ports. And so we've really expanded our approach and tried to bring on additional partners, additional expertise in order to have that more holistic approach as we're working with communities and be flexible that to respond to what is a priority for them. Next one. So I just wanted to give an example of this work. One of the first communities we began to partner with is Pinpoint. It's a Gullah Geechee community in Chatham County in the northern part of the Georgia coast. Gullah Geechee people, if you're not familiar with that term. They are descendants of enslaved Africans who were forced to work on rice, indigo, and cotton plantations. And they were often located on isolated barrier islands along the southeast. And so there is the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor that runs from North Carolina down to the northern part of Florida. That is a national heritage area and recognized by the U.S. government. So Pinpoint is one of those communities. And because many Gullah Geechee communities were isolated, they've retained a lot of their language and food and music and culture over the years. You can go on to the next one. So we've been meeting with Pinpoint. We have monthly community-wide meetings that are really well attended, and we also have a committee with the leadership of the community that we meet with weekly, and began to talk with them about different priorities that they had in building their resilience. Some of these relate to climate change, and then some of them are, sort of outside the scope of climate change, but I wanted to just provide you some of the issues that they're thinking about. Traffic control, a lot of traffic going through there, high speed, and they've already made progress on that where they're getting speed bumps installed, paid for by the county. They have a lot of power outages that relate to hurricanes, and they are also making progress on that where they're getting trees trimmed and dead trees removed. They are working on establishing resilience hubs throughout the community where they can share emergency equipment and resources. They're also really concerned about flooding. And so we've been helping them partner with the Army Corps of Engineers and get information about their flood risk and potential actions to take. Failing septic systems also related to flooding, and then also just the age of the systems, heirs properties, healthcare, healthy food, and then a lot of youth engagement and enrichment. So we're going to be investing as part of those resilience hubs, having spaces for workforce development, having K through 12 education opportunities. Next one. And so I just wanted to highlight real quick, as part of our partnership with Pinpoint, we realized that, let me back up. Hopefully you've heard of the Justice 40 initiative. It was established by the White House several years ago, where 40% of overall benefits from federal climate, clean energy investments have to go to disadvantaged communities. And so the federal government developed a tool called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool to identify where these disadvantaged communities are located. As we were working with Pinpoint, we realized they are in a census tract that is not being categorized as disadvantaged. And so they will not qualify for Justice 40 funding. This is because they've been in their location a very long time. They're right on the water, a lot of coastal development around them, wealthier neighborhoods that are bringing their census data up for that census tract. And so they're not qualifying. And we wondered, are they the only communities that are experiencing this? We suspected no, but we didn't really know how to go about it. And so we partnered with the Pinpoint Betterment Association and the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission. We studied 145 Gullah Geechee communities and found that about half are impacted by this same problem. And so we just released a report. I'd be happy to share it with y'all. But this isn't just a problem for Gullah Geechee communities. It really is any community that's where it's a small segment of a census tract that's surrounded by wealthier neighborhoods could be impacted and have trouble accessing Justice 40 funding. So just a heads up about that. And then finally, I wanted to share a resource, and I'll put this in the chat, the link to it. This has really been a guiding factor for me in my work in thinking about how I'm partnering with communities and checking myself. It kind of gives guidance on how much funding you're allocating in your projects to communities versus keeping internally, how much role and ownership and power you're allocating to communities. And so I just find it really helpful as I'm thinking about, who's setting the agenda, who's, establishing who's going to be invited to meetings. Those kind of questions about process, this can be really helpful. And I believe that's it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jill. And Dawood is going to be up next. Before that, I just want to give a shout out to Chayton, a young student who is watching with the rest of the audience here. And I'm glad he's there. So, and Dawood, if you can take it from here, I hope that, folks, you're kind of processing, everything that we're talking about and kind of listening and hearing some of the different ways that we're doing this work. All right, there you go.
Thank you. And thank you, Jazz, because this is a great deal of information to take in, especially if you're kind of new to this type of information. I am Daoud Shabaka, and I am with the with Harambe House, and we are the Citizens for Environmental Justice. First of all, I want to thank Drawdown, Georgia, and 100 Miles for providing me this opportunity to be on this panel. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists, Christy and Jill. I have a great deal of respect for their work, and I'm kind of honored to be on this panel with them. I wanted to talk briefly about the Harambe House. My boss is the founder, Dr. Mildred McLean. She's kind of a known commodity here in Savannah, born and raised here. She traveled the world and then returned to Savannah a little over 30 years ago to found the Harambe House. It was founded by a request from a community on the west side of the city, Hudson Hill, as a matter of fact, because they were concerned about a radioactive spill that happened at the Savannah River plant in the late 80s. They were not happy with the federal response. They felt that the Department of Energy was not responding quickly enough. They asked for some assistance from Dr. McLean. She was able to really bring this concern to a large audience, the state of Georgia, and to DC, the Department of Education itself. And movement began, and redress was made for residents in South Carolina and here in Savannah. It was that incident that showed her the need for something like the Harambe House. So she began it. Her first program was what has now become the Black Youth Leadership Development Institute, a annual training institute for Black youth in the city to learn how to become the leaders that they truly are themselves. After that, she developed a series of other programs and projects, mostly directed by the concerns of community residents. The Harambe House serves the entire city of Savannah, but we concentrate on the west side of the city because those communities are closest to the port and surrounded by the 17 industries that do business with the port. So there are several projects and programs I can talk about. I could actually take up the rest of the time here. I won't. Talking about the work that Dr. McLean and the Harambe House is doing. But I wanted to really kind of concentrate on just a couple of main points before we hand the mic back over to the rest of the panel. One of the things that we discovered and we realized in working with the issues that are coming from these community residents, like I said, mostly in the West Side, is that the idea of resiliency is is somewhat fluid. It's both a idea for collecting resources, but it's also a way of life. How we define resiliency here at the Harambe House is therefore twofold. There's a capacity to secure and maintain the required resources and to develop sustainability practices needed to anticipate, respond to, and rebuild after an emergency or a severe weather event or a unanticipated occurrence. But then there's also the other part of resiliency. It's to develop and provide mechanisms to mitigate ongoing issues of legacy pollution, but also the daily exposure to such things as diesel particulate matter, fumes from diesel exhaust, and the daily work-related toxin exposures. And why that is so important is, growing up, we all heard the term blue collar work, right? We know that's kind of a 9-to-5 situation. Well, unfortunately, for a number of low-income families and for maybe immigrant families, first or second generation families, those are the jobs that they can acquire. Those jobs require staying at the work site, and it may involve the use or the operation, the exposure to chemicals and toxins that the rest of us may not have daily exposure to, but they do. So how do you deal with a ongoing daily exposure to toxins and maintain your health? A lot of times that is really not a concern, a thing that is held in mind, but it is a concern for those who have jobs of menial labor or janitorial work. I could name off several jobs that are involving daily exposure to chemicals that can be caustic to respiratory systems or to human skin on a regular basis. This is the type of resiliency that's not always spoken of, but that we kind of look at. And one of the issues that we are very much concerned with is legacy pollution. This is pollution that occurs in the communities I'm speaking of that impact particular groups of people. The Black population, people of color, and immigrant populations who, because of racism or classism, have found over generations that the only housing, the only communities they can be a part of are near ports or industrial areas. This is the environment that Dr. McLean discovered when returning here to Savannah. And to begin to look at what solutions can be found, how a process for mitigating these concerns can be developed, it became clear that the individuals who are constantly exposed to this hazardous conditions, they are the ones who are best at coming up with solutions. We like to refer to our community residents in these communities as the subject matter experts. Jill talked about that is one aspect of the SEER Hub project, where they are actually going to the residents in Pinpoint and asking them for the directions and solutions to the issues. That is we feel a correct response to the question of how do we deal with those problems and those issues. It's also one of the reasons why we were very happy to join Georgia Tech and the SEER Hub project, because they recognize that to deal with these issues, we have to go straight to the individuals impacted mostly by those issues. We at the Harambe House also see the best method to use to find solutions to the issue of resiliency is to follow the environmental justice principles that were instituted back in 1992 at Washington, D.C. by the People of Color Conference. And the main point of the environmental justice principles are the recognition that the planet, Mother Earth, is our home. It provides the environment for our health and survival, also the mechanisms to maintain that, but with a concerted effort on our part, humanity's part, to be stewards of the planet and to help Mother Earth repair itself and thus provide us with the environment that we require to live and breathe healthily, you know. But it also talks about working from the bottom up to ensure that everyone in society receives the benefits of that society. You begin by working with, conversing with, making decision-making policies and processes with the most impacted, the least of these, as it were. Work from the bottom up. Here at the Harambe House, we're not really sure that the present outlook and the present method of dealing with these issues is from a totally and completely bottom-up process. We feel and we work toward a change of consciousness, as it were, to begin to look at, if we are truly talking about equity, then we need to adjust how public policy is administered, how public policy is decided, and how governance is conducted. That is quite a feat in and of itself, but that is one that we feel is a true method to begin to make solid and consistent change. We feel the most effective way to deal with the issues that are impacting all of us, from sea level rise to the constant increase in use of single-use plastics, the use of pesticides, on and on, is to begin to have a different approach to look at conversing with the impacted communities, who we call frontline and fence line communities, and develop a more practical, real world solution base to the issues that are before us. I'm going to end there, and only because I would like to really go into more of a dialogue on these issues and the issues that were brought up by my two fellow panelists, because we need to find a more efficient way of dealing with the issues that are before us. I read a report earlier today, just one article, but I think there'll be several more. The scientists are a little concerned we're past the tipping point. And if that, cry for help is in fact true or near the truth, then we need to accelerate the work that we're doing to remediate the issues that we face. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jill, and I'm sorry, to Megan and Jazz. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawood. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Christy. It's so much great information. We're at the point now where we'd like to encourage the panelists and the audience to ask questions. I have a couple of questions, and Jazz has a couple of questions for the panelists, but we want to encourage the panelists, as Dawood mentioned, to have a dialogue with each other. But Christy, I have a question for you to kick it off, and that's about the oyster project that you mentioned. Could you just briefly kind of walk through, you did a little bit, but even more in depth, walk through the benefits of oysters, not only in our ecosystem, but yes, definitely in the ecosystem, but also in our economic system, and how your project is kind of doing what Dawood said, which is kind of working from the bottom up, but also on all levels to improve resilience across the coast.
Thank you, Megan. Love to. One of the ways in looking at oysters and thinking about how they themselves, they are a type of nature-based solution to some of the issues that we have along the coast. And we've also learned a lot from other states, thinking about the Northeast, where they have issues with pollution and different types of practices along their coastline, that they're trying to restore from that. And oysters is one of the ways. And it's great in Georgia, we have the opportunity to be proactive and really be thinking about oysters as a nature-based solution from the very beginning. And so how they can help protect our shorelines, our coastlines, by providing a protective layer. They think about the oysters and how they're structured, and to be able to break the wave energy, decrease erosion along the coastal areas, while at the same time they're filtering the waters, and they're providing an economic resource that it can be sustainable. I'm just very hopeful that by working in partnership, working with fishers and farmers and people in the communities that have experience with oysters and shellfish, and that can come up with some solutions. And these right now, and working to develop and test different methods on how to grow oysters. And then there's that science part. So it's that blending of bringing in the local communities with this knowledge and traditions, and then also adding the science, bringing in more science to that, working with for example, right now we're working with, I'm real fortunate to be working with UGA and their Sea Grant program. And we have a fellow, Daniel Harris, who is working with us on this integrated oyster management planning process and bringing together different communities and people into the process to plan and really be proactive. And so how do we know where the best places to grow oysters, where the best places to protect oysters? Well, there's that science, and DNR is bringing in some of the science with their aquaculture program and working with federal partners and NOAA too. So bringing in the science, but also having it come up from the communities and those people that have been in this area and have this expertise, and others out there like Ernest McIntosh that want to share that. So those are some of the ways, and to be able to have this inclusive process. Right now, we're bringing together some of the science so we can have and share this with all so that we have a better sense of where those oysters are, where the oyster information is, what are the gaps, and then how can we partner to fill some of those gaps and integrate the community as really leaders in that process. And so that we can have oysters and these other nature-based solutions really be activities, be solutions, nature-based solutions for our communities and contributing to the economy too. And I really also am hopeful with oysters that we can use that as a way to talk about the coast and the importance of the coast and the connections of the people to the coast and the future of the coast. But thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you, Christy, for answering that. And I just want to follow with that too, that what is unique about that is that when you talk about nature-based solutions too, is that communities that, especially coastal communities, but even inland communities, have always had those solutions within the communities, right? And so, when TNC can work with communities and support, that knowledge that they already have in the space, because I always say that the people that are in the communities that are closest to these, in these frontline communities and closest to the spaces, they were the buffers that existed. And when they got displaced, that's when you started to have astronomical problems, right? Because you have people that move into those spaces that don't respect the culture, they don't respect the, nature, don't respect the ecology and things like that. So thank you so much for that. I guess my question is next is for Jill, and I think Dawood will be able to add on to this. But you talked about even with this SEER hub, kind of working with communities and allowing them to lead. I think the framework usually is, you get funding and, you sort of get some input from communities, but usually, the one with the most resources and power kind of drives things. But what you're saying is that it should be the other way around. And then I guess at the end of that, I know that you work with alongside Dawood and kind of hearing his perspective on that too.
Yeah, I think we're trying to, I guess, invert what's traditionally done, which is that the institutions are the kind of driving force of the project and are at the center of the project, and really making it more the communities, and that the communities are the ones that are having the resources to build their capacity and implement their ideas. And the researchers are sort of on the providing support for that. And, I think for me personally, one of the reasons that kind of brought me to that realization that this needed to happen, I helped develop the first sea level rise plan on Tybee Island back in 2016, which is only 8 years ago. And it was the first sea level rise plan. Oh, I'm sorry, my dog's going crazy. Sorry. Okay. And so as we took, what was on Tybee a very successful project in planning for sea level rise, I'm sorry, I'm going to move places. We realized that actually some of the practices that we were using could exacerbate inequality within the community. And that using kind of traditional practices, we're not going to be successful, especially when you're moving into marginalized communities. And so realizing that I had those blind spots, it's made me more cognizant that we really have to be working with community members who may be able to spot where there's issues, where there could be unintended consequences of actions, better than I can, and maybe even better than the local government can. That they have perspectives based on history of, how things have been implemented, where trust has been broken, where there's been inequity in the past. And it's really critical to have those voices helping to lead projects. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm sorry for the dog disruption.
And Dawood, I guess I wanted you to kind of add to that, but I think, you're in a unique space where you not only like work with academic institutions such as Georgia Tech with the SEER Hub, which is very new, but you also work with the city of Savannah. So you're working with local governments and municipalities and also other nonprofit organizations. So how do you truly create, these authentic partnerships, I guess is my question, that can be helpful and not be harmful, because people, can have great intentions, but yet inadvertently cause more harm. So how does, how are you doing that with the work at Harambe House?
Thank you for that. One thing that became clear with our work with the different partners and with our academic partners like Georgia Tech and Savannah State University is that when we went to particular communities on the west side that had suffered from pollution in various different ways for generations, for a number of decades, the first obstacle that we had to overcome was the rebuilding of trust. Even though Dr. McLean and Harambe House have been known to be partners in dealing with issues, we still had to go into particular communities that we may not have had a relationship with and rebuild that trust connection over a 2, 3, 4, 5 year period. And we did that simply by a continued communication and constant our consistency in responding to their questions and their concerns. Once that was established, then we have a road to begin to actually work on the issues that they have in front of them. Because the issues that they have brought to us, and I'm speaking specifically of 2 particular communities, I don't believe they would have an issue with me naming them, Hudson Hill and Ogeechee. They've come to us with issues that have been on their table for since the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, because they've felt that local government and state government simply ignored their concerns and their requests for aid. Building that level of trust is just a necessary element, and then we can move forward. In Hudson Hill and neighboring West Savannah, one of the items that they would like to look at is how can we reduce our energy burden? Well, let's get solar. A great idea. And there are some financial granting programs that would allow them to afford to get solar placed in their homes. But they run into an issue. When you put solar on your roof, you need to make sure that your roof is stable. Right? A lot of homes on the west side of the city were built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They don't have current modern installation. So, and because of that, and because of other issues of not being able to receive loans to upgrade and fix up their homes, right? Their roofs are in need of repair, but also their homes need energy efficiency refurbishment. So a lot of households that may qualify financially for solar panels, they don't qualify physically, and that the reason why they were not able to get the loans for house upkeep has nothing to do with them. It has to do with society's tendencies to be racist and sexist over the years. Well, that's improved up to today, although, you know, there's arguments both sides of that. But we still have the issue of, all right, how do we upgrade their homes? So that is just one type of issue that's involved with this concern. We need to look at the mechanisms that were in place or have been in place that have restricted a number of households from receiving the education or the medical services or the opportunities or the transportation that other communities have received, and begin to redress those issues. And that is that's a complicated and convoluted matrix of issues to deal with. That's why what the SEER Hub is doing, going and operating from the bottom up, it allows those communities to begin to redress those items one at a time. So Pinpoint is looking at, we need to slow down traffic, right? And repair the roads. And oh, by the way, can we get speed bumps in here? And we need to maybe cut away some of these trees to prevent them from falling in severe weather or causing other issues like, power line disruptions and so on and so forth. And by the way, maybe we can come into the 21st century out here in Pembroke and put those power lines underground so that they're not even an issue. So those are the types of things that the community residents themselves began to point out that the city or local or county may not have been aware of, and that's why that bottom up approach is so effective.
This is great. I have a question for all of you. I don't know which one of you wants to answer or if all of you want to answer it. It's 3:11, so I just want to be aware of the time. So maybe only one of you should answer, but I don't care which one. Anyway, sorry to ramble. My question is, all of you have described work to improve resilience of Georgia's coastal communities when it relates to adversity, right? So Jill, you put it in a way that I thought was very interesting. So it was like immediate catastrophe. I can't remember the two words, strain and stressors or something like that, but and also ongoing stressors, right? Well, I think as traditional environmentalists, and me having been trained as a traditional environmentalist, I think we've been trained to think like we can just come in and move forward. Like we can just come in and the minute we get there, everything's different. But all three of you have described, I think, what we have all been experiencing over the decades, and that is that you can't just come in and like, here I am to save the day. You have to come in and address the problems that have gotten us to this place, and their historical problems and their issues that have caused people trauma, and their issues that have broken down trust and have been the result of dysfunctional relationships. And as an environmentalist, with my environmentalist hat on, it's like, well, no, but it's about the science. So I want to know how you bridge those two kind of, both of them are truths, but how do you bridge them so that we can actually make progress together and people heal and the environment and people are stronger moving forward? Don't all jump at once.
I'll toss out one just quick thought that comes to mind. A thing that I think is very important is to be, from the very start, to be sharing, well, yes, that science is important, to bring it together, and then to share that broadly for all to be able to engage and to have this inclusive engagement and to take that, to have the short-term look, yes, but also to have these long-term views and plans that we keep reminding. And by working together, having the shared vision, then we can keep making progress and looking out to that long term by working together and having those metrics, milestones.
Yeah. Also, and this kind of relates a little bit to what I was saying about concerning the trust issue. We're talking about intelligent people. They may not have the resources that a Georgia Tech has, but they're certainly wise enough to see issues and come up with solutions. We're finding, as we're talking to residents on the west side of the city, that they want to do the science themselves. And so community-based participatory research is an approach that Harambe House is looking at, that the Georgia Tech is already doing with a number of communities. Jill didn't mention, for example, that part of the Smart Sea Level Sensor project is that they've already gone into Woodville High School and Mercer Middle School and with a curriculum so that the junior high and the high school students are themselves building these sensors now and also programming them. Right? Well, we're discovering that on the west side of the city, the adults want to do the same thing, right? I've started giving training on mapping tools. We're starting out with EPA's EJ Stream tool, but we're also looking at CJUST, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening tool, and some other tools, because they want to begin to map out areas on the west side, look at and pull down demographic data sets, and then begin to themselves go to the Department of Public Health and say, okay, in Ogeechee, we're finding that the particulate matter reading is at the 97th percentile. We'd like to get some health data over the last 15 to 20 years on asthma and diabetes. So we'd like to compare. So they're asking themselves, so the idea of science is not opposite bottom up, but it's more and. So we have the community residents themselves wanting to learn the science, or at least the beginning parts of the science, so that they can know the process, apply it themselves, and begin to look at solutions from that standpoint.
And I know, Megan, you said you don't need to hear from everyone, but but the thing that keeps me up at night is the science is changing so quickly still with climate change and sea level rise. I'm on the NASA, I'm on an advisory board for the NASA sea level change science team. And, you know, keeping up with that in itself is a lot of where the latest, sea level rise science is going. But then also understanding, the changes that are happening within our coastal communities, understanding, how our environment is changing at, at a local scale and development and policy, and the intersection of all of that is really overwhelming. And there's no way that any one of us can kind of wrap our arms around the full scope of this problem. Climate change is so complex, and the impacts of it are so intracted and touch on so many different aspects of our lives and the world around us, that the only way, in my mind, we can move forward is through collaboration, where we all have a little piece of the solution, and we just have to put our heads together and be inclusive in that. And maybe that way we can make improvements and help build a more resilient coastal Georgia. But that takes time. That requires me to get to know Dawood and know, where his, knowledge can interact with my knowledge. And, and so that it does require slowing down quite a bit, which is scary when you see how fast things are changing and being impacted. So there's a little tension there, but.
Yeah, I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to, of course, um, ask ask one another question. I just want to point out one thing too, is that as we're having this conversation, I'm just thinking about, the power dynamics, right? Who has the power when we're talking about working in these spaces and communities, and are they sharing it? Are they sharing that power in a way that is, creating, actual trust or building trust and creating partnerships? And I think that's part of what we're talking about, all three of you really, in this conversation. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to, we're having a conversation to ask, one another, questions if you have them. I might not really. Well, I'll tell you, there's one.
I have Jazz,
Oh, go ahead.
can I ask you a question?
Me?
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, how do you feel? You're working throughout the Georgia coast. You have a great perspective. I mean, where do you see, I guess, kind of what are some of the best practices that you've observed that you would recommend, to all the participants to think about in their own work?
Man, I think, I think they need to think about what relationships they don't have, right? I was sitting in a meeting the other day where someone was talking about work on ditches and culverts in communities, and they had no idea that they were uh, these neighborhood assemblies that existed in the space. So they were kind of giving reports to different agencies, but not, the leaders of the neighborhood. So I would say, to people looking around in the space that they're working in, who is it that they have not, talked to? What are the organizations that, are having difficulty, not only making an impact, but getting by? And maybe that's the partnership that they need to, look at. And I think the other side of it is just looking in the mirror and looking at yourselves and looking at your organization. I always tell people what's unique for me is that I work for 100 Miles, and environmental justice strategist, but, I also come from, SAPLA. I work with, I'm on the board of Sidecars, and I work with Solo and Hog Hammock Foundation, and all these different organizations. So it's like being in two completely different spaces and being able to, kind of see this broad and bigger picture where, you know, you can have a lot of resources in a space, but those resources not be accessible to people that need them the most, and that can go for funding and that can go for all those things. And so how do we, find ways to change that? And I think we constantly have to hold ourselves accountable and realize that it's okay to mess up, or realize that, we need to change how we do things. Maybe we've done them this way for a while. Well, maybe it's time to change that, you know. And that can be tough because what's comfortable is what's comfortable, and sometimes we use data and numbers that say that we shouldn't change. But those shouldn't be the drivers. It should be about the communities and people. So thank you for that question.
You want to close us out? We have to wrap up. I'm sorry that we have to go. We don't have any more time for questions, but you want to close it out?
Terrible time to wrap up. No, I'm kidding. No, this has really been great. I just want to, thank all of our panelists and also you, Megan. And I would just
thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all for being here.
Encourage all of you to think about what it is that, you can do differently when you're talking about communities, when you're talking about when you really authentically want to help or to partner, in a space, or to join, the fight that's already been ongoing, because in a lot of these spaces, people have already been fighting, so just keep that in mind. And I think we just have to humble ourselves and recognize that, we're all still learning, but what are you doing with the power you have in the space that you occupy should be the question that we should always be asking ourselves. So,
yeah. All right. Well, I just especially want to thank the panelists and Drawdown Georgia for having us. And I hope y'all have a great afternoon. And I look forward to seeing y'all again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists and all those that join us too. So y'all are great.